The valley had a way of swallowing hope. It sat wedged between two ridgelines like a scar in the earth, narrow and mean, where the sun hit hard during the day and the cold came down cruel at night. The kind of place that made promises it never intended to keep. Caleb Voss had been working this land for 6 years, and in all that time the ground had given him just enough to survive and nothing more. His ranch, if you could call it that, consisted of a weathered cabin with a sagging porch, a barn that listed slightly to the east, and about 200 head of cattle that grazed on grass so sparse you could count the blades. The fence line ran for miles, patched and repatched with whatever wire he could scavenge. Every morning before dawn, Caleb would walk those fences, checking for breaks, for cuts, for the signs that someone was testing him. Lately, those signs had been everywhere. It started small. A section of fence down on the northern property line, easy to miss, easy to blame on the weather. Then another, this time with clean cuts that no storm could make. Caleb fixed them without comment, his face expressionless as he twisted new wire into place, his hands working with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from doing a thing 10,000 times. Then the water trouble began. The creek that fed his land started running foul. At first, it was just a bad smell, something chemical and wrong. His cattle wouldn't drink from it. Caleb followed the water line upstream for 3 miles until he found where someone had dumped lamp oil into a pool that fed the flow. He spent 2 days digging a bypass channel with nothing but a shovel and his own stubbornness, redirecting clean water around the contamination. He didn't report it, didn't ride into town to complain. He just fixed it and moved on. When 15 head of his cattle vanished in a single night, he tracked them to a box canyon 5 miles west, found where they'd been penned and then driven off. The tracks led toward the main road, then disappeared into harder ground. He rode back alone, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the horizon like he was reading a language most people had forgotten. The town of Ashford sat 8 miles south, a cluster of buildings that pretended to be a community. There was a saloon, a general store, a church that hadn't seen a real preacher in years, and a sheriff's office that might as well have been a museum for all the law it enforced. Caleb went there once a month for supplies, and every time he did, he felt the weight of eyes on him. People looked at him differently now. There was Sam Pickett, who ran the general store, a soft man with nervous hands who used to greet Caleb with genuine warmth. Now he barely made eye contact, just tallied up the purchases and took the money with hands that shook slightly. When Caleb asked him once if everything was all right, Sam had looked at him like a man confessing to a priest. "You should think about moving on, Caleb," he'd said quietly, glancing toward the door as if someone might be listening. "There's better land elsewhere." "I like this land," Caleb had replied, his voice flat. Sam had looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in his expression had shifted, from pity to something closer to fear. "It ain't about what you like anymore." That conversation had been 3 weeks ago. The pressure had increased since then, methodical and deliberate. More fences cut. His water poisoned twice more. A fire started in his hay storage that he'd caught early enough to beat down with wet blankets and sheer determination. And everywhere, that same careful absence of witnesses. No one saw anything. No one knew anything. The message was clear: leave or be removed. Caleb didn't leave. He couldn't explain it, not in words that would make sense to someone else. It wasn't about the land itself. This valley was hard and unforgiving, and there were easier places to make a life. It wasn't even about pride, though he supposed that played a part. It was something deeper, something that lived in his bones. A line that once crossed would mean he'd spent the last 6 years lying to himself about who he was. Because Caleb Voss wasn't really Caleb Voss. That name was a thing he'd chosen the way you choose a coat, something to wear that fit well enough and didn't draw attention. His real name, the one he'd been born with and made famous before he buried it, was Elias Crow. For 5 years, Elias Crow had been the fastest exhibition shooter anyone had ever seen. He'd traveled with shows, performed in front of crowds that numbered in the thousands, and made money hand over fist doing things with firearms that shouldn't have been possible. Splitting playing cards edge on at 30 paces. Shooting the flames off candles without touching the wax. Hitting 6 targets in the time it took most men to draw and aim at one. The shows had been spectacle, carefully choreographed and rehearsed, but the skill was real. Elias had been born with an eye that could track movement like a hawk following prey, and reflexes that operated faster than conscious thought. By the time he was 20, he could draw and fire with a speed that looked like magic. By 25, he'd stopped trying to get faster and started focusing on precision. The crowds loved him. The money was good, and the life was eating him alive. Because between the performances, there were other requests. Men who'd seen the show and wanted to know if Elias would put that skill to different use. Business disputes that needed settling. Debts that needed collecting. Problems that could be solved with the right application of fear and violence. Elias had said no. Again and again, he'd said no. Until the night in Dodge City, when he'd said yes. The details didn't matter anymore. Some cattle baron's son had gotten himself into trouble with the wrong people, and the baron had offered Elias enough money to retire on if he'd make the problem go away. Elias had told himself it was justified, that the men he'd be facing were criminals anyway, that he'd just be evening odds that were already unfair. He'd killed 3 men in a Kansas warehouse, quick and clean, before the 4th one had gotten a shot off that grazed Elias's ribs and made him stumble. That stumble had saved his life. The return fire meant for his chest had torn through his shoulder instead. He'd killed the 4th man anyway, bleeding and shaking, and then he'd collected his money and disappeared. The wound had healed. The reputation had not. Within a month, Elias Crow's name was being attached to every unsolved killing from Texas to Montana. Some of it was true. Most of it wasn't. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd become a story people told, and stories had a way of attracting attention he didn't want. So he'd buried Elias Crow. Stopped performing, stopped shooting, stopped being the person he'd been. He drifted west, changed his name, and found this miserable valley where no one knew him and no one asked questions. For 6 years, it had worked. The guns were still there, of course, buried in a wooden box beneath the floorboards of his cabin, wrapped in oilcloth and kept clean out of habit more than intention. 2 Colt 45s with custom grips and actions he'd modified himself, balanced and weighted for his hands specifically. He hadn't touched them in 6 years, hadn't even looked at them, but he knew exactly where they were. The sun was setting on a Wednesday when the riders came. Caleb was on his porch, mending a bridle that had cracked, his hands working the leather with practiced patience. He saw them when they were still a mile out, 3 shapes moving through the heat shimmer, coming from the direction of town. He didn't stop working, but his attention sharpened, his eyes tracking their approach with the same focus he'd once used to mark targets. They rode in a loose triangle formation, the kind men use when they're expecting trouble but trying not to show it. As they got closer, Caleb could make out details. The leader rode a big roan gelding, sat too far back in the saddle like a man who'd learned to ride late in life. Older, maybe 50, with a thick mustache and a belly that pushed against his vest. To his right, a younger man, lean and jumpy, with a rifle in a saddle scabbard that he kept touching like a nervous habit. To the left, a third rider who sat his horse better than the other 2, quiet and watchful, with eyes that moved constantly. They stopped 30 feet from the porch, close enough to talk without shouting, far enough to have room if things went wrong. Caleb set down the bridle and stood. Didn't say anything, just looked at them. The leader took his time, making a show of surveying the property like he was appraising livestock. When he finally spoke, his voice had that particular quality of a man used to being obeyed. "You'd be Caleb Voss." It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. "I would." The man reached into his vest and pulled out a badge, tarnished silver, the kind you could buy from any number of catalogs if you had $5 and no conscience. He held it up like it meant something. "Name's Clayton Morris. I represent the Territorial Land Development Commission." He said it like he'd practiced, all the words in the right order. "We're here on official business." Caleb looked at the badge, then at Morris's face, then at the other 2 riders. The young one was sweating despite the cooling air. The quiet one hadn't taken his eyes off Caleb. "Official business," Caleb repeated, his voice neutral. "That's right." Morris tucked the badge away and pulled out a folded paper instead. "Seems there's been an assessment error on this property. Taxes owed going back 4 years, plus penalties and interest. Comes to about $800. Caleb had paid his taxes every year on time to Sam Pickett at the general store who served as the county assessor. He had receipts in a tin box inside the cabin, but he didn't mention that. Instead, he just stood there, waiting. Morris seemed disappointed by the lack of reaction. He shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking. "Now, I can see you're a reasonable man, so I'm going to give you a choice. You can pay what's owed, or you can sign over the deed to this property in satisfaction of the debt. Either way, we need this settled. By when? Caleb asked. Sunrise tomorrow. The quiet rider's horse shifted weight, and the man's hand dropped to rest casually near his sidearm. The movement was subtle, practiced. Caleb noted it without reacting. And if I don't do either? Caleb's voice remained even, almost conversational. Morris smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then we come back and remove you. For your own safety, you understand? Man who can't pay his legal obligations, who knows what other laws he might be breaking. We'd hate to see you get hurt resisting a lawful seizure. The young rider's hand was shaking where it gripped his reins. The quiet one just watched, his face expressionless. Caleb stood there on his porch, the setting sun painting everything orange and gold, and felt something shift inside him. It was a small thing, like a door opening in a room he'd kept locked for years. He could feel the weight of the guns beneath the floorboards, could remember the exact texture of the grips against his palms. He could see how this would play out if he let it. They'd come back tomorrow with more men. They'd burn him out or shoot him down, and whatever story they told afterward would be the only story that mattered. The town would look away. Sam Pickett would sell his store to someone else, and this valley would swallow one more broken promise. Or he could stop running from the thing he'd been trying to leave behind. Morris was still talking, saying something about how this didn't have to be unpleasant, how there were better opportunities elsewhere, how a smart man knew when to fold. Caleb wasn't really listening anymore. He was doing calculations in his head, the kind he hadn't done in 6 years. Distance, angles, draw speed, firing sequence. The mathematics of violence, still sharp despite the years of disuse. The quiet rider saw something change in Caleb's expression. His hand moved another inch closer to his gun. Sunrise, Morris said again, his voice harder now. You be gone by sunrise or we'll make you gone. That clear enough for you? Caleb looked at him, really looked at him, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet the three men had to lean forward to hear it. Crystal clear. Morris seemed satisfied with that. He nodded, gathered his reins, and started to turn his horse. The other two followed his lead, the young one looking relieved, the quiet one still watching Caleb with those careful eyes. They were 20 feet away when Morris called back over his shoulder. Smart choice, Voss. Smart choice. Caleb didn't respond. He watched them ride away until they were just shapes in the gathering dark. Then he turned and walked into his cabin. Inside, the space was sparse and functional. A bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a stove, some shelves with supplies. The floorboards were rough pine, fitted together with gaps you could see through to the dirt below. Caleb walked to the spot 3 feet from the bed, knelt down, and worked his fingers into the gap between 2 boards. The section came up easily. He'd designed it that way. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth that was still supple despite the years, was the wooden box. His hands hesitated for just a moment before he lifted it out. The oilcloth unwrapped smoothly. The box was plain cedar, unadorned, with a simple latch. He opened it and looked at what he'd buried 6 years ago. The guns looked like they'd been cleaned yesterday. He'd done good work preserving them, and the dry climate had helped. 2 Colt 45s, the metal dark with use in oil, the grips custom fitted and worn smooth where his hands would rest. Beneath them, 2 gun belts with loops for ammunition, and 6 boxes of cartridges still sealed. Caleb lifted out the first gun, his hand finding the grip with muscle memory that made the intervening years meaningless. The weight was exactly as he remembered, perfectly balanced, the center of gravity sitting just forward of the trigger guard. He worked the action slowly, feeling the precisely fitted parts move against each other with almost no friction. Then he drew. The movement was rusty, slower than it used to be, but it was still faster than most men could track. The gun came up smooth and level, his arm extending, his eye finding the sight picture automatically. He dry-fired, the hammer falling with a crisp click. Then again, and again. Each draw slightly smoother, slightly faster. The muscle memory coming back like words to a song he'd known by heart. Whoa. He spent an hour like that, just drawing and dry-firing, letting his body remember what his mind had tried to forget. By the end, sweat was running down his face and his shoulder ached, but the draws were clean. Not as fast as they'd been. Not yet. But fast enough. When full dark had fallen, he loaded both guns with hands that didn't shake, even though something inside him was trembling. He strapped on the gun belts, settling them on his hips with the weight that felt both foreign and familiar. Then he walked outside. The night was clear, the stars scattered across the sky like thrown dice. Caleb set up 6 tin cans on fence posts at varying distances, 10 feet, 20, 30, and so on. Then he walked back to the porch and stood there, his hands loose at his sides. He breathed, let the night air fill his lungs, let his eyes adjust to the starlight until he could see each can clearly. Then he drew. The first shot was loud in the silence, muzzle flash bright against the dark. The nearest can jumped and clattered. He fired again before the first can hit the ground. Then again. Again. The last shot took the farthest can, and then there was just silence and the smell of gunpowder. 6 shots. 6 cans. Maybe 4 seconds, start to finish. His hands were steady when he reloaded. Not as fast as Elias Crow had been, but faster than Caleb Voss needed to be. He holstered the guns and stood there in the dark, listening to his heartbeat, feeling the old familiar focus settling over him like a coat he'd left hanging and just now put back on. The men who were coming tomorrow expected a farmer, a man alone, scared, with nowhere to go and no way to fight back. They were going to find something different. Caleb walked back inside, took off the gun belts, and set them on the table where he could reach them quickly. Then he lay down on his bed, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. He didn't sleep. Didn't expect to. Just lay there in the dark, thinking about boundaries and the cost of defending them. Thinking about the man he'd been and the man he'd tried to become, and the question of whether there was really any difference. Somewhere around midnight, a coyote started howling in the hills. Another answered from the opposite ridge. Their voices carried across the valley, wild and lonesome, singing songs that had no words. Caleb listened until the sound faded, then closed his eyes and waited for sunrise. Dawn broke cold and pale, the kind of morning that felt more like an ending than a beginning. Caleb had been awake for hours, sitting at his table with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, watching the darkness outside his window fade to gray. The gun belts lay in front of him, the leather dark and supple, the metal catching what little light filtered through the curtains. He'd spent the hours before dawn thinking about choices, about how a man could spend years building a life only to watch it collapse because someone else decided it should, about how the world was full of people who believed that force was the only language worth speaking, and how you couldn't reason with men like that. You could only answer in terms they understood. When the sun finally cleared the eastern ridge, painting the valley floor in shades of copper and gold, Caleb stood and strapped on the guns. The weight settled on his hips with a familiarity that made his chest tighten. He checked each weapon methodically, verifying the loads, testing the actions. Then he walked outside. The air was still cool, carrying the smell of sage and dust. His cattle were grazing on the slope to the west, dark shapes moving slowly through the sparse grass. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday, as it had for the past 6 years. Ordinary, peaceful. The kind of morning that promised nothing but another day of hard work and small rewards. Caleb knew better. He walked to the barn and led his horse out, a sturdy bay gelding named Rust, who'd been with him for 4 years. The horse nickered softly, pushing his nose against Caleb's shoulder in greeting. Caleb ran his hand down the animal's neck, feeling the warmth of muscle beneath the hide. "Might get loud today," he said quietly. "Try not to spook." He didn't saddle the horse, just led him around to the side of the cabin, where there was good grass and access to the water trough. If things went the way he expected, Rust would be safer there, away from the direct line of approach. Caleb tied him with a quick release knot, the kind you could undo with one pull if you needed to leave in a hurry. Then he walked back to the porch and waited. The sun climbed higher. The shadows shortened. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, the sound sharp and lonely. Caleb sat in one of the 2 chairs he kept outside, his posture relaxed, his hands resting on the armrests. To anyone watching from far off, he would have looked like a man with nothing more pressing on his mind than watching the day unfold. But his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the approaches, marking the terrain, calculating fields of fire and cover positions. The old skills coming back without conscious effort, layering tactical awareness over the peaceful morning like a second vision. They came at mid-morning, when the sun was high enough to make the heat shimmer but not yet brutal. 5 riders this time. Caleb spotted them when they were still 2 miles out, a plume of dust rising from the main trail. He stayed seated, watching them approach with the same patient attention he gave to everything. As they got closer, he picked out details. Clayton Morris on the same roan gelding, riding at the center, the nervous young man from yesterday on his right, the quiet, watchful one on his left, and 2 new additions, Men who sat their horses with the ease of people who spent more time in the saddle than on foot, both wearing guns low on their hips in the way that suggested they'd had occasion to use them. Professional help. Morris wasn't taking chances. They rode straight up to the property line and stopped, arrayed in a loose semicircle about 40 yards from where Caleb sat. Morris walked his horse forward a few paces, separating himself from the others. "Mr. Voss," he called out, "I see you're still here." Caleb didn't stand, just tilted his head slightly in acknowledgement. Morris made a show of looking around the property, at the cabin, the barn, the cattle on the distant slope. Then he looked back at Caleb with an expression that was meant to convey disappointment but came across as satisfaction. "I gave you fair warning," Morris said. "Told you to be gone by sunrise. Now you've put us in an unfortunate position." "Seems to me," Caleb said, his voice carrying across the distance without strain, "the only position anyone's in is the one they chose." One of the new men, a thick-shouldered character with a scar running down his left cheek, shifted in his saddle. "You got a smart mouth for a man who's about to lose everything." Caleb looked at him. Didn't say anything, just looked. The man's hand moved toward his gun, a reflexive gesture, but Morris held up a hand. "Easy now, Garrett. We're still being civilized here." Morris turned his attention back to Caleb. "Last chance, Mr. Voss. You can ride out now, leave the deed on the porch, and we'll call this settled. No one needs to get hurt." "No one needed to come here in the first place," Caleb replied. "But here we are." Morris's expression hardened. The pretense of civility dropped away like a mask he was tired of wearing. "You're not hearing me. This land is being claimed under territorial authority. You can accept that and walk away with your life, or you can be stupid about it. Your choice." Caleb stood then, a slow uncoiling that brought him to his full height. The morning sun was behind him, putting his face in shadow, making it hard to read his expression. He took 3 steps forward to the edge of the porch and stopped. "I paid my taxes," he said. "Got receipts that prove it. You want to talk about territorial authority? We can ride into town right now and sort this out with the county clerk." "The county clerk answers to us," Morris said flatly. "Then I guess we don't have much to talk about." The quiet man who'd been there yesterday spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly soft. "Morris, he's wearing guns." Every eye shifted, focusing on the belt around Caleb's waist, the 2 Colts resting in their holsters. The nervous young man's face went pale. Garrett's hand dropped fully to his weapon. Morris's eyes narrowed. "That's supposed to scare us?" Morris asked. "You're 1 man. We're 5. You want to push this to gunplay? It's going to end one way." "Probably," Caleb agreed. "Question is whether you want to be around to see it." There was a moment of absolute stillness, the kind of silence that happens right before something breaks. The horses sensed it, ears swiveling, weight shifting. The hawk that had been circling overhead veered away, as if even it knew to clear the area. Garrett drew first. He was fast, faster than most men Caleb had seen. His gun came up smooth and level, his thumb pulling back the hammer as the barrel cleared leather. A professional draw, practiced and confident. He never got the shot off. Caleb's right hand moved, and the Colt appeared in it like a magic trick, the draw so fast it looked like the gun had simply materialized. The report cracked across the valley, harsh and flat. Garrett jerked backward in his saddle, his gun falling from suddenly nerveless fingers, a red stain spreading across his chest. He made a sound, halfway between a cough and a gasp, then toppled sideways and hit the ground hard. The other new man, younger than Garrett, with a thin mustache and wide eyes, went for his gun a half-second later. Caleb's second shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He screamed, high and piercing, clutching at the wound as blood welled between his fingers. Morris was shouting something, yanking at his own sidearm, his horse dancing sideways. The quiet man had drawn too, his movements deliberate despite the chaos. The nervous young man just sat frozen, his face the color of ash. Caleb shot the quiet man in the leg as the man's gun came level. The bullet punched through muscle and shattered bone, and the man went down with a grunt, his horse bolting at the sudden weight shift. He hit the ground and tried to roll, still gripping his weapon, still trying to bring it to bear. "Don't," Caleb said. The quiet man looked up at him from the dirt, pain etched across his features, and something in Caleb's voice made him freeze. Whatever he saw in Caleb's eyes killed the fight in him. He let the gun drop. Morris had finally gotten his weapon clear, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't aim. His horse was panicking, spinning in tight circles, and Morris was hauling on the reins with one hand while trying to point the gun with the other. The combination wasn't working. Caleb raised his Colt and put a round into the dirt 3 feet in front of Morris's horse. The animal reared, dumping Morris backward out of the saddle. He landed hard on his back, the air whooshing out of his lungs, his gun flying from his grip. The whole thing had taken maybe 5 seconds. Garrett lay still in the dust, his blood soaking into the dry earth. The man with the shoulder wound was on his knees, rocking back and forth, making small whimpering sounds. The quiet man sat where he'd fallen, pressing both hands against his shattered leg, his face gray with shock. Morris was on his back, gasping like a landed fish. And the nervous young man hadn't moved at all, both hands raised now, showing he wasn't armed. I'm not, the young man stammered. I didn't draw. I didn't. I noticed, Caleb said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. Climb down off that horse, slow. The young man dismounted with exaggerated care, his movements jerky with fear. When his boots hit the ground, his knees nearly buckled. What's your name? Caleb asked. Danny Reeves. You from around here, Danny? No, sir. From Kansas. Morris hired me last week to help with... He stopped, seeming to realize what he was about to admit. To help steal land, Caleb finished for him. Danny's throat worked. I needed the money. I didn't know. I didn't think... You didn't think it would go like this, Caleb said. Nobody ever does. He gestured toward the wounded men. Check on them. See who can be saved. Danny moved on shaking legs toward the man with the shoulder wound, pulling off his own bandana to press against the injury. The man hissed in pain, but let him work. Morris had finally gotten his breath back. He rolled onto his side, then pushed himself up to sitting, dirt coating his clothes and face. He looked at Caleb with an expression that cycled through shock, fear, and then settled into something uglier, raw hatred. You're a dead man, Morris wheezed. You know that? You're a dead man walking. Caleb walked down off the porch, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. He moved past Morris without looking at him, heading toward the quiet man who sat clutching his leg. Up close, Caleb could see the damage. The bullet had hit just above the knee, and there was a lot of blood. Too much. What's your name? Caleb asked. The man looked up at him. His face was pale but composed, the kind of control that came from dealing with pain before. Harlan Cross. You've been shot before. Twice. Harlan's jaw was tight. Never this bad. You're going to need a doctor, soon. Caleb glanced at the wound, then back at Harlan's face. Your friends are going to have to get you to town fast, or you'll bleed out before noon. Ain't my friends, Harlan said through gritted teeth. Just a job. Bad job. I'm noticing that. Caleb studied him for a moment, then nodded and walked back toward Morris, who'd managed to get to his feet. The older man swayed slightly, one hand pressed to his ribs where he'd landed. You just killed 2 men, Morris said, his voice shaking with rage. Shot 3 others. You think you can just walk away from that? You think there won't be consequences? There's always consequences, Caleb replied. What? Question is who pays them? The law. Caleb's voice cut across him like a blade. You came here with fake papers and hired guns, trying to run me off land I paid for. You poisoned my water, stole my cattle, cut my fences, and you want to talk to me about law? Morris's mouth opened and closed. No words came out. Caleb took a step closer, and Morris flinched. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get your men patched up enough to ride. Then you're going to get them to a doctor in town. And while you're there, you're going to tell everyone exactly what happened here. I'll tell them you murdered... You'll tell them the truth, Caleb said, his voice dropping to something quiet and deadly. You'll tell them you came here to take my land by force. You'll tell them you drew on me first. And you'll tell them what happened when you did. And why would I do that? Because if you don't, I'll come find you. And next time, I won't leave witnesses. The words hung in the air like smoke. Morris stared at him, and whatever he saw in Caleb's eyes made something inside him crumble. The bluster, the authority, the pretense of power, all of it drained away, leaving just a scared man in dirty clothes who'd bitten off more than he could chew. You're crazy, Morris whispered. Maybe, Caleb said, but I'm the one still standing. He turned his back on Morris and walked over to where Danny was trying to stop the shoulder wound from bleeding. The young man looked up as Caleb approached, fear still written across his features. "How's he doing?" Caleb asked. "Bad," Danny said. "Bleeding won't stop." Caleb knelt down, holstered his gun, and took a look. The bullet had gone clean through, which was good, but it had torn up a lot of tissue on the way. The man was conscious but fading, his skin clammy and pale. "What's your name?" Caleb asked him. The man's eyes focused with difficulty. "Pete. Pete Lawson." "Well, Pete, you're going to have to hold on a bit longer. Your friend here is going to tie this off tight. Then you're all going to ride for town. You make it to Doc Warren, you'll live." "Hurts," Pete managed. "I imagine it does. Try not to think about it." Caleb showed Danny how to tie the bandana properly, tight enough to slow the bleeding without cutting off circulation entirely. Then he stood and looked at the 3 wounded men and Morris, who'd retrieved his gun from the dirt but hadn't made any move to use it. "Garrett's dead," Caleb said, pointing to the still form lying nearby. "You'll need to take him with you. The rest of you can ride if you help each other." "We can't. Harlan can't sit a horse like that," Danny protested. "Then tie him in the saddle. Figure it out." Caleb's voice wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. "You've got maybe 2 hours before Harlan bleeds out and Pete goes into shock. I'd suggest you stop arguing and start moving." Morris found his voice. "You expect us to just leave? To let you get away with this?" "I expect you to make a choice," Caleb said. "You can stand here trying to figure out how to salvage your pride, or you can save your men. But you can't do both, and the clock's running." For a long moment, Morris just stood there, his face working through emotions too fast to track. Then he turned to Danny. "Get Garrett over his horse. Tie him down." Danny nodded and moved to comply, relief evident in his posture. It took them 20 minutes to get organized. Danny did most of the work, lifting Garrett's body and securing it across the saddle, then helping Pete mount and holding him steady while he got his balance. Harlan proved the biggest challenge, conscious and coherent, but unable to put weight on his shattered leg. They ended up sitting him in the saddle backward, with his good leg hooked over the horn for stability and his wounded leg dangling. It wasn't dignified, but it might keep him alive. Morris didn't help. He just stood there, clutching his ribs, watching Caleb with eyes that promised nothing good. When they were finally ready to move, Danny looked at Caleb. "What about you? What are you going to do?" "I'm going to stay here," Caleb said. "It's my land. They won't let this go, you know that, right? Morris, he's connected to—" Danny stopped, glancing at Morris nervously. "To who?" Caleb asked. Danny's mouth opened, but Morris cut him off. "Shut your mouth, boy." But Danny had already decided something. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the simple recognition that he'd gotten mixed up in something worse than he'd bargained for. "The Garrison Company," he said quickly. "The real outfit behind all this. They're buying up the whole valley, pushing out anyone who won't sell." "Danny, I swear," Morris started. "He's going to find out anyway," Danny shot back, some steel entering his voice for the first time. "You think after today you can keep it quiet? The whole territory is going to know what happened here." Morris glared at him but didn't argue. Caleb filed the name away. "The Garrison Company. They in town?" "No," Danny said. "They operate out of Silver City, about 60 miles west. But they've got people everywhere, lawyers, businessmen, politicians. This valley's just one of a dozen they're trying to consolidate." "For what?" "Railroad's coming through, or might be. Depends on the route they choose. The valley's one of the options, and if it comes through here, the land will be worth 10 times what it is now." It made sense. More sense than fabricated tax bills and crooked badges. The kind of sense that came with real money and long-term planning. Men didn't just want Caleb's land. They wanted everyone's land, the whole valley. So when the railroad arrived, they'd own both sides of the negotiation. "How many others?" Caleb asked. "How many others have they pushed out?" Danny looked uncomfortable. 7, maybe 8 families in the last 6 months. Most of them just sold when the pressure got bad enough. Couple of them. He trailed off. "Couple of them what?" "Disappeared," Danny said quietly. "Left in the night, or that's what people say. Their places burned down a few weeks later. Accidents, supposedly." Caleb absorbed this, his expression unchanging. "And the town just let it happen. The town's scared. Garrison Company made examples of the first couple people who caused trouble. Sheriff got replaced. Couple of council members decided to retire. After that, everyone got the message. Except me." "Except you," Danny agreed. "But they thought you'd be easy. Just one man, no family, No connections. Should have been simple. Should have been, Caleb echoed. Morris had heard enough. This is a waste of time. We need to move before Harlan dies. He was right about that. Harlan's face had gone from gray to white, and his breathing was shallow. Pete wasn't much better, slumped in his saddle and held upright mainly by Danny's grip on his arm. Caleb stepped back, giving them room. Straight to Doc Warren. Don't stop, don't get distracted. You make it there in the next hour and a half, you might all live. Danny nodded and swung into his own saddle. He gathered the reins of the horse carrying Garrett's body, then took Pete's reins as well, preparing to lead him. Morris mounted with a grunt of pain, still favoring his ribs. Harlan's horse stood patient while the injured man swayed in the backward position, both hands wrapped around the saddle horn in a white-knuckled grip. They started to move, a slow procession heading south toward town. Caleb watched them go, standing there in the morning sun with his hands hanging loose at his sides. When they were about 50 yards away, Morris turned in his saddle and looked back. "This isn't over," he called out. "It is for today," Caleb replied. Morris started to say something else, then thought better of it. He turned forward and kept riding, his back stiff with anger and humiliation. Danny looked back too, but his expression was different, not angry, almost apologetic. He raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or a farewell, then faced forward and focused on keeping Pete upright. Caleb stood there until they were just shapes in the distance, until the dust they raised was the only sign of their passage. Then he holstered his guns, walked back to the porch, and sat down in the same chair he'd occupied before. The morning was quiet again. The hawk had returned, circling high overhead. His cattle grazed peacefully on the western slope, undisturbed by the violence that had erupted and ended so quickly. The blood in the dirt was already starting to dry, turning from bright red to brown. Caleb's hands were steady. His breathing was normal. But inside, something was shaking. He'd killed a man, maybe two, if Pete didn't make it to the doctor in time. He'd shot 3 others, crippled one of them probably permanently. And he'd done it all in the space of a few seconds, with the kind of cold precision he'd spent 6 years trying to forget he possessed. Elias Crow would have been proud. Caleb Voss felt sick. He sat there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, listening to the wind move through the valley. Eventually, he stood and walked out to where Garrett's blood stained the ground. He looked at it for a moment, this evidence of choice and consequence, then went to get a shovel. By the time he'd buried the blood under fresh dirt and smoothed it over, the sun was directly overhead. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands ached from gripping the shovel. He walked to the water trough and splashed his face, the cold shocking against his skin. Russ nickered from where he was tied, a questioning sound. Caleb walked over and untied the quick-release knot, then led the horse back to the barn. He gave him grain and fresh water, ran his hands over the animal's legs, checking for any problems, found nothing wrong. "You did good," he told the horse. "Stayed calm when it mattered." Russ pushed his nose against Caleb's chest, content. Back in the cabin, Caleb stood at the table and looked at the guns he'd removed and set down. They needed cleaning, powder residue, carbon buildup, the normal maintenance after firing. He'd always kept his weapons immaculate, another habit from his old life. He started to reach for them, then stopped. His hands were shaking now, just slightly, but enough to notice. Delayed reaction, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. He sat down hard in the chair, put his head in his hands, and breathed. The thing about violence was that it happened fast. Training, muscle memory, instinct, all of it compressed into seconds that felt both endless and instantaneous. You didn't think. You just acted. And it wasn't until afterward, when the immediate threat was gone and your body remembered it was human, that the reality of what you'd done settled in. Caleb had killed before. In Dodge City, in that warehouse, he'd taken 4 lives and walked away. But that had been different. He'd been younger, caught up in the moment, convinced he was doing the right thing. And afterward, he'd run. Changed his name, changed his life, spent 6 years trying to become someone else. This time, there was nowhere to run. This was his land, his choice, his stand, and the consequences were going to come looking for him whether he stayed or left. After a while, the shaking stopped. Caleb lifted his head, took a deep breath, and reached for the guns. His hands were steady again as he field stripped them, cleaned each part methodically, and reassembled them with the same care he'd always taken. When they were pristine again, he loaded them and set them back on the table within easy reach. Then he went outside and started on the day's chores. There were fences to check, cattle to tend, 100 small tasks that didn't care about what had happened that morning. The work was familiar, grounding, a reminder that life went on regardless of the violence that occasionally interrupted it. As the sun began its descent toward the western ridge, Caleb stood at his fence line looking south toward town. Somewhere down there, Danny and Morris were telling their story. Doc Warren was working on Harlan and Pete, trying to save what Caleb's bullets had torn apart. And people were hearing about what happened, forming opinions, making decisions. By tomorrow, the whole territory would know. Caleb Voss had drawn a line, and he'd proven he'd kill to defend it. The question now was what came next. The rider came alone 3 days later, just after noon, when the heat was starting to build. Caleb spotted him from a half-mile out, a single figure on a gray horse, moving at an easy pace that suggested he wasn't in a hurry and wasn't trying to hide. No dust cloud behind him, no companions flanking wide. Just one man, riding straight up the valley like he had every right to be there. Caleb was mending fence on the northern section when he saw him. He'd spent the past 3 days working from sunup to sundown, keeping his hands busy and his mind occupied. The guns stayed on him now, even when he was working. He'd gotten used to the weight again, the way they shifted against his hips when he bent down or reached up. It felt natural now, which bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He set down the wire cutters and wiped his hands on his pants, watching the rider approach. Not Morris. This man sat his horse differently, with the relaxed confidence of someone who'd grown up in the saddle. As he got closer, Caleb could make out more details. Older, maybe 60, with white hair visible beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Well-dressed for the frontier, wearing a vest and clean shirt despite the dust. No visible weapons, though that didn't mean much. The man stopped about 20 yards away and raised one hand in greeting, palm open and empty. "Mr. Voss?" he called out. "That's right. My name's Henry Blackwood. I'm hoping we can talk." "We're talking now." Blackwood smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I meant in a civilized manner. Perhaps some shade and water for my horse. I've ridden a fair distance." Caleb studied him for a long moment, weighing options. Then he nodded toward the cabin. "Water troughs by the barn. Help yourself." They walked in silence, Caleb a few paces behind and to the side. Close enough to talk, far enough to react if things went wrong. Blackwood seemed to understand the positioning and didn't comment on it. At the barn, he dismounted with the stiffness of a man who'd been riding for hours and led his horse to the trough. "Beautiful animal," Blackwood said, nodding toward Rust, who stood watching from inside the barn. "Good bloodlines, I'd wager." "He does his job." "That's all any of us can ask, isn't it? To do our job well." Blackwood let his horse drink, then tied the reins loosely to a post. "I appreciate the hospitality." "Haven't offered any yet," Caleb said. "Just water for your horse." "Fair enough." Blackwood turned to face him fully, his hands hanging loose at his sides. Up close, his age showed more clearly, deep lines around his eyes and mouth, sun damage on his skin, the kind of weathering that came from decades outdoors. But his eyes were sharp and assessing. "I suppose you know why I'm here." "I can guess." "Then let me confirm. I represent the Garrison Company. You've heard the name?" "I've heard it." Blackwood nodded slowly. "Then you understand the situation you're in. What happened 3 days ago, that was unfortunate, regrettable, but it doesn't change the fundamental reality. Which is, this valley is being consolidated, the railroad's coming through, and when it does, the land values will increase substantially. The Garrison Company has been working for 2 years to acquire the necessary parcels to make that development possible." He paused, watching Caleb's face for reaction. "You're the last holdout." "That's not my problem." "Actually, Mr. Voss, it is. Because without your cooperation, a significant investment of time and capital is at risk. That makes it everyone's problem." Caleb crossed his arms. "I paid for this land, built a life here. You want me to just walk away because it's inconvenient for some company I've never heard of?" "I want you to be reasonable," Blackwood said, "to recognize that this is bigger than one man's stubbornness. The railroad will bring prosperity to this entire region. Jobs, commerce, growth. Fighting it is like trying to hold back the tide. Plenty of other routes for a railroad. Not as direct, not as profitable. This valley's the optimal choice, and the company has already invested heavily in that assumption." Blackwood reached into his vest pocket slowly, giving Caleb time to see it wasn't a weapon. He pulled out a folded document and held it up. I'm authorized to offer you $5,000 for your property. That's more than triple its current value. Not interested. Mr. Voss, please consider. I said no. Blackwood's expression shifted, the polite veneer cracking slightly. You killed a man, wounded 3 others. Do you understand the legal jeopardy you're in? They came to my land with guns, tried to force me off. I defended myself. That's one version of events. Clayton Morris tells a different story. Morris is a liar. Perhaps, but he's a liar with connections, with resources, with the backing of people who can make your life very difficult. Blackwood tucked the document back in his pocket. The company would prefer to handle this peacefully. The offer stands, $5,000 and a clean departure. But if you refuse, other measures will be taken. Like what happened to the others? The families that disappeared, the burned-out ranches? Blackwood's face went carefully neutral. I don't know what you're referring to. Sure you don't. What I know, Blackwood said, his voice hardening, is that you're making a serious mistake. The incident 3 days ago? That could be overlooked, smoothed over, if you're willing to cooperate. But if you continue to resist, if you continue to be an obstacle, then the company will have no choice but to remove that obstacle by whatever means necessary. That a threat? It's a statement of fact. The railroad is coming, Mr. Voss, with or without you. The only question is whether you walk away rich or get buried poor. Caleb was quiet for a moment, looking at this well-dressed man who spoke of murder and dispossession like they were simple business transactions. Men like Blackwood were more dangerous than Morris and his hired guns, because they convinced themselves that money made everything moral, that enough profit justified any action. Here's my statement of fact, Caleb said. This is my land. I'm staying on it. Anyone who tries to take it by force is going to get the same treatment Morris did. You want to test that? You're welcome to try. Blackwood studied him, recalculating. You were a shooter once, before you came here. Elias Crow, that was the name, wasn't it? The name hung in the air like a knife. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. I don't know anyone by that name. Please, Mr. Voss. Or should I say Mr. Crow? The company does its research. Exhibition shooter, fastest draw most people had ever seen. Then you disappeared after some trouble in Kansas. Blackwood smiled without warmth. You've been hiding out here, playing farmer, pretending to be someone else. But you can't hide from what you are. And what's that? A killer. A man whose only real skill is violence. 3 days ago proved it. You went right back to what you're good at. Blackwood took a step closer. So here's the real question. How long can you sustain it? Because the company has resources you can't imagine, money, men, influence. They can bring pressure that doesn't end, and eventually you'll slip. Eventually you'll lose. It's mathematics. Caleb met his gaze without flinching. Maybe. But how many people die before that happens? How much does it cost the company? Because I promise you, I won't go cheap. You'd sacrifice everything just to prove a point? I'd sacrifice everything to hold what's mine. There's a difference. Blackwood shook his head slowly, something almost like pity crossing his features. You're making yourself into a martyr for a piece of land that isn't worth dying for. Then why's the company trying so hard to take it? That landed. Blackwood's jaw tightened, and for a moment the mask slipped entirely, showing the cold calculation beneath. Because we can. Because we've invested too much to let one stubborn fool derail everything. Because this valley, your land specifically, is the keystone. Without it, the entire consolidation falls apart. Then I guess you've got a problem. No, Mr. Voss, you do. Blackwood moved back toward his horse, his movements deliberate. I came here to make a reasonable offer. You've rejected it. What happens next is on your head. He untied his horse and swung into the saddle with practiced ease. Looking down at Caleb, his expression was almost regretful. You should know, the company's already filed charges. Murder, assault with a deadly weapon, resisting legal authority. There's a warrant being drawn up as we speak. The territorial marshal will be here within a week. Morris came here with fake papers and hired guns. That'll be your word against his. And Morris has witnesses, documentation, the backing of respectable businessmen. What do you have? The truth. Blackwood actually laughed at that, a sound without humor. The truth is whatever a judge decides it is, and judges, like everyone else, can be influenced. He gathered his reins. Last chance, Mr. Voss. Take the money. Leave tonight. By morning, the warrant disappears and you're free to start over somewhere else. No. Then may you find whatever it is you're looking for out here in this miserable valley, though I suspect all you'll find is an early grave." He turned his horse and rode away without looking back, moving at that same easy pace he'd arrived with. Caleb watched until he was out of sight, then stood there a while longer thinking about what had just been said and what it meant. A marshal coming. Legal charges that would force him to leave his land or be arrested on it. And behind all of it, the weight of a company with money and power enough to bend the law to their purposes. He walked back to the cabin, his mind working through scenarios and options. Inside, he pulled out the tin box where he kept his receipts and documents. Proof of purchase, tax payments, everything legal and documented. It might not matter if the judge was bought, but it was something. Then he sat at the table and did something he hadn't done in 6 years. He wrote a letter. The words came slowly at first, rusty from disuse. He addressed it to a man named Thomas Garrett in Silver City, someone he'd known in his Elias Crow days. Garrett had been a journalist then, working for one of the territorial papers, always sniffing around for stories about the exhibition circuit. They'd shared drinks a few times, traded stories. Caleb didn't know if Garrett was still alive, still working, still in Silver City, but it was worth trying. In careful script, he laid out what was happening. The pressure from the Garrison Company, the attempts to force him off his land, the violence 3 days ago. He included names, Morris, Blackwood, the Garrison Company itself. He explained about the other families that had been driven out, the pattern of intimidation and violence that had cleared the valley. He didn't mention his real name, that secret he kept. When the letter was finished, he sealed it in an envelope and addressed it. Then he walked out to the barn and saddled Rust. The ride into Ashford took an hour and a half, and the whole way Caleb stayed alert, scanning the terrain for ambush. The guns on his hips felt heavier than usual, the weight of what might be coming pressing down on him. The town looked the same as always, weathered buildings lining a dirt main street, a few horses tied at the hitching posts, the general air of a community that had seen better days and was waiting for worse ones. But the atmosphere was different. Caleb felt it the moment he rode in. People stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman hustled her children inside, her face tight with something between fear and disapproval. Sam Pickett stood in the doorway of his general store, his expression carefully neutral, and made no move to greet Caleb as he usually did. The whole town knew what had happened, and they'd already decided which side they were on. Caleb tied Rust outside the post office, a cramped building that also served as the telegraph office, and occasionally as a courtroom when the circuit judge came through. Inside, a thin man with spectacles looked up from a ledger, saw who had entered, and went pale. "Mr. Voss," he said, his voice strained. "I wasn't expecting, that is, I didn't think—" "I need to post a letter," Caleb said, setting it on the counter along with the coins for postage. The clerk looked at the letter like it might bite him. "Silver City?" "That's right. It'll take 3, maybe 4 days to get there, depending on the stage schedule." "That's fine." The clerk took the money with shaking hands and stamped the letter. Then he looked up at Caleb, something close to desperation in his eyes. "Is it true what they're saying about what happened?" "Depends what they're saying. That you killed Garrett Dean in cold blood. Shot Pete Lawson and Harlan Cross. That you're trying to hold the valley hostage, stopping progress, keeping the railroad out." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That what Morris told people?" "That's what everyone's heard. The company put out a statement, said you're dangerous, unstable, that you attacked their legal representatives without provocation." "And you believe that?" The clerk looked away. "Doesn't matter what I believe, matters what the marshal believes when he gets here." "When's that supposed to happen?" "Word is he's already on his way. Could be here tomorrow, could be a week. But he's coming." The clerk hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Mr. Voss, if I were you, I'd leave. Just pack up and go. There's no winning this." "Maybe not," Caleb said, "but I'm not running." He turned to leave, but the clerk called after him. "Wait, there's something you should know." Caleb stopped. "Doc Warren. He's been talking. About the men you shot. He said the wounds told a story, if you knew how to read them." The clerk glanced toward the door, making sure no one was listening. "Said Garrett was hit center mass, perfect shot. Said Pete and Harlan were wounded in non-lethal spots, deliberate placement. Said it looked like someone who knew exactly where to shoot and what it would do. So he's been telling people that it wasn't some wild gunfight, that you controlled it, start to finish, that if you'd wanted them all dead, they would be." The clerk met his eyes. Some folks are thinking maybe Morris's story doesn't add up. It was a small thing, but it was something. Doubt was a crack in the foundation, and cracks could spread. Doc Warren say that publicly? Not yet. But he might, if the right person asked him. Caleb nodded slowly. Appreciate the information. He left before the clerk could say anything else, stepping back out into the afternoon sun. The street was still watching him, still silent with judgment and fear. He untied Rust and swung into the saddle, his movements deliberate and unhurried. As he turned to ride out, a voice called from across the street. Caleb? He looked over. Sam Pickett stood on the porch of the general store, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face conflicted. Sam, can we talk? Just for a minute? Caleb considered riding past, then thought better of it. He guided Rust across the street and stopped in front of the store. Sam came down the steps, moving like a man walking to his own execution. I need you to know, Sam said quietly. I didn't want any of this. What they did to you, what they've done to others, it's not right. But you didn't try to stop it. Sam's face crumpled. What could I do? I'm just a shopkeeper. I've got a wife, 3 kids. The company made it clear, cooperate or lose everything. So you chose. I chose to survive. Same as you're doing now, just in a different way. Sam looked up at him, pleading for understanding. They're going to kill you, Caleb. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but eventually. The marshal's just the first move. If that doesn't work, they'll send more men, better men. They'll keep coming until you're dead or gone. I know. Then why? Why not just take their money and leave, start over somewhere they can't find you? Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching the main street, the buildings, the people who'd made their own accommodations with power. Because if I run now, I'll keep running. And eventually, I'll run out of places to go, or I'll run out of reasons to keep going. That's just pride talking. Maybe. Or maybe it's something else, a line you don't cross no matter the cost. Sam shook his head. Lines don't mean much when you're dead. They're all that means anything. There was nothing more to say after that. Sam stepped back, his face sad and resigned, and Caleb touched his hat brim in farewell. Then he rode out of town, feeling the weight of eyes on his back the whole way. The ride home was quiet, the sun dropping toward the western ridge, the shadows lengthening across the valley floor. Caleb took his time, letting Rust set the pace, his mind turning over possibilities and consequences. A marshal coming meant a legal fight he probably couldn't win. Even if Doc Warren spoke up, even if the truth came out, the company had the resources to shape the narrative. They could bring in witnesses, produce documents, overwhelm whatever defense Caleb mounted with sheer volume of official-looking lies. And if the legal approach failed, they'd try something else. More guns, better shooters. Men who wouldn't underestimate him like Morris had. Professionals who did this for a living and knew how to handle someone like Elias Crow. He should leave. Tactically, strategically, any rational assessment said he should take what he could carry and disappear into the territories where even the Garrison Company couldn't reach. Start over again. Find another valley. Another name. But the thought made something in his chest tighten. Because Sam was wrong. It wasn't about pride. It was about the recognition that running solved nothing. That men like Blackwood and companies like Garrison existed everywhere. And eventually you had to make a stand or admit that nothing belonged to you, that everything could be taken by whoever had more money or more guns. By the time he reached his property, the sun was touching the ridgeline. He unsaddled Rust, gave him grain and water, checked him over for any problems. Then he walked to the porch and looked out over his land. 200 head of cattle grazing on sparse grass, a cabin that leaked when it rained hard, fences that needed constant repair, a well that sometimes ran low in summer. Nothing special, nothing worth dying for by most people's measure, but it was his. He'd paid for it honestly, worked it with his own hands, made it into something that sustained him. And that had to mean something, had to be worth defending, or else what was the point of any of it? The sun dropped below the ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The temperature dropped with it, the heat of the day bleeding away into the cooling air. Caleb sat in his chair and watched the stars come out one by one, bright and cold and indifferent to the troubles of men. Somewhere to the south, a marshal was riding toward him with papers and authority and the weight of law behind him. Somewhere to the west, in Silver City, Henry Blackwood was probably reporting back to his employers, telling them that negotiation had failed and more direct measures would be necessary. And here, in this narrow valley between two ridge lines, Caleb Voss sat alone with his guns and his choices, waiting for whatever came next. He didn't sleep that night, just sat on the porch as the moon rose and tracked across the sky, his eyes scanning the darkness for movement, his ears tuned to sounds that didn't belong. Every snap of a twig, every shift of wind, every distant coyote call got his attention and assessment, but nothing came. The night passed quiet and cold, and when dawn finally broke over the eastern ridge, Caleb was still sitting there, tired but alert, watching the sun paint his valley in shades of gold. He had no illusions about how this would end. Men with enough money and determination could accomplish almost anything, and the Garrison Company had both. Eventually, they'd find a way to remove him, legally or otherwise. But until that happened, this land was his, and he'd make them pay for every inch of it. The marshal arrived on the 5th day, riding a black mare with 3 deputies trailing behind him. Caleb had been expecting them since dawn, had watched their dust cloud form on the southern horizon and grow steadily larger as they approached. He was sitting on his porch when they arrived, same as he'd been when Morris came, his hands resting easy on his knees, the guns on his hips visible but not threatening. The marshal was a big man, maybe 50, with a weathered face and gray in his beard. He wore a proper badge, not the mail-order kind Morris had flashed, and he sat his horse with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this work for a long time. His deputies were younger, hard-looking men who kept their hands near their weapons but didn't draw. They stopped 30 feet from the porch, same distance Morris had chosen. Interesting how men thought in similar patterns when they were uncertain about what might happen next. "Caleb Voss," the marshal called out. "That's right. I'm Marshal Thomas Henning, Territorial Authority. These are my deputies, Wade, Carter, and Mills. We're here on official business. Seems to be a lot of that going around." Henning's mouth twitched. Might have been the start of a smile. "I suppose it does. Mind if we talk? I'd rather do this civilized." "Help yourself." The marshal dismounted, gestured for his deputies to stay mounted. He walked forward slowly, his hands visible and empty, stopping at the base of the porch steps. Up close, Caleb could see the scars on his knuckles, the lines around his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises. A working lawman, not a political appointment. "Got a warrant here," Henning said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Murder, assault, resisting legal authority, based on a complaint filed by Clayton Morris and witnessed by 3 others. Morris came here to steal my land, brought guns to make it happen." "That's your version." "That's what happened." Henning studied him for a long moment. "You know how this looks, don't you? One man against a company with lawyers and documentation. Whatever the truth is, they've got the weight of paper behind them. And you've got that warrant." "I do." Henning didn't move to execute it, just stood there holding the paper. "But I've also got questions. About why a land development company needs hired guns. About why 7 other families in this valley suddenly decided to leave in the past 6 months. About fires and disappearances that don't add up." Caleb felt something shift, a small recalculation of possibilities. "You've been asking around. It's my job to ask around, and the more I ask, the less I like what I'm hearing." Henning folded the warrant and put it back in his coat. "But questions don't change the law. You killed a man, wounded 2 others. That's not in dispute. They drew first. According to who?" "According to the kid, Danny Reeves. He was there. He saw the whole thing. Danny Reeves left town 2 days ago. No one knows where he went." Henning's expression was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. Convenient, isn't it? The one witness who might support your story just disappears. Caleb's jaw tightened. Danny had seemed genuinely shaken by what happened, genuinely conflicted about his part in it. But scared men ran, and Danny had looked scared enough to keep running until he found somewhere far from this valley and whatever the Garrison Company might do to loose ends. "What about Doc Warren?" Caleb asked. "He examined the wounds, can tell you they weren't random shots. Doc Warren's an old man who treats whoever pays him. His medical opinion won't carry much weight against eyewitness testimony from 3 men who say you opened fire without warning. 3 men who work for the company. 3 men who'll swear it in court." Henning shifted his weight, one hand resting on his belt near his gun. "Not a threat. Just habit. Here's where we stand, Mr. Voss. I can execute this warrant right now, take you into custody, and you can try to make your case in front of a judge. Or you can come with me voluntarily, make it easier on everyone." Either way, I leave my land. Either way, you come to town until this gets sorted out. Caleb looked past Henning at the three deputies still mounted, still watching. Good positions, spread out enough that they couldn't all be taken down in one sweep. Professional setup. Even if Caleb wanted to fight his way out, and part of him did, that old Elias Crow part that calculated angles and odds automatically, the math didn't favor it. And while I'm in town, Caleb said, what happens to my property? That's between you and whoever has a claim to it. The company will move in the minute I'm gone. You know that. Henning's face was unreadable. I know a lot of things I can't do anything about, but I can't let you stay here under armed guard while this plays out. You're either coming in peacefully or we're bringing you in the hard way. You try the hard way, some of your men won't make it home. It wasn't a boast, just a statement of fact. Henning heard it for what it was, and something flickered across his face. Not fear exactly, but a recognition of stakes being raised. Maybe so, Henning said quietly, but you won't either. And for what? So you can prove you're faster than 4 men? So you can die on this porch defending a piece of land that'll be taken from you anyway, just by a different set of people? At least I'll die on my feet. Dead is dead, Mr. Voss. Doesn't matter what position you're in when it happens. They stood there in the morning sun, 2 men who understood violence and its consequences, weighing the cost of choices that couldn't be unmade. Behind Henning, one of the deputies shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. The sound was loud in the silence. Finally, Henning spoke again. I don't work for the garrison company. I work for the territory, for the law as it's written. And the law says you need to answer for what happened here. But the law also says you get a fair trial, a chance to present your evidence. Maybe that doesn't seem like much, but it's what I can offer. And if the judge is bought, if the jury's been paid off, then you'll lose. Henning's voice was flat, honest. But at least you'll lose in a courtroom instead of bleeding out on this porch. That's something. Caleb thought about the letter he'd sent to Silver City, about Thomas Garrett and whether a journalist's investigation might change anything. Thought about Doc Warren and the medical evidence that might cast doubt on Morris's story. Thought about the slim chance that somewhere in the legal machinery there might be someone who cared more about truth than money. It wasn't much to hope for, but it was more than he'd have if he died here today. I'll need to secure my property, Caleb said. Take care of my animals. You've got an hour. My men and I will wait here. Caleb stood and walked into the cabin without another word. Inside, he moved quickly but methodically. He gathered what documents he had, deeds, receipts, anything that proved his legal claim to the land, put them in a leather satchel along with some clothes and what money he'd saved. Then he walked to the loose floorboard and knelt down. The guns could stay. If he rode into town wearing them, it would be seen as provocation, an invitation to violence. Better to go unarmed, let Henning think he was cooperating fully. The ammunition and cleaning kit went back in the wooden box, everything wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath the floorboards. But one gun he kept, a smaller revolver, a .38, he'd carried for backup in his Elias Crow days. It fit in an ankle holster beneath his pants leg, invisible unless you knew to look for it. Not ideal for a fast draw, but better than nothing if things went wrong in town. Outside, he spent the next hour taking care of Rust and his cattle. He opened the gate to the larger pasture, letting the herd spread out where there was more grass and access to the creek. They'd be fine for a while, even unsupervised. Rust got extra grain and fresh water, and Caleb spent a few minutes just standing with the horse, one hand on his neck. Don't know when I'll be back, he said quietly. Might be never. Try not to miss me too much. Rust pushed his nose against Caleb's shoulder, warm breath huffing against his shirt. When the hour was up, Caleb walked back to the porch where Henning waited. The deputies had dismounted now, standing in a loose group, watching everything with professional caution. Ready? Henning asked. As I'll ever be. I'll need your weapons. Caleb unbuckled the gun belt and handed it over. Henning took it with a nod of appreciation for the quality, then passed it to one of the deputies. You'll get them back when this is done, Henning said, assuming the judge rules in your favor. And if he doesn't? Then they'll be sold to cover court costs and damages. Caleb swung into Rust's saddle, the satchel tied behind him. Henning mounted his black mare, and the deputies took positions around them, not quite prisoner's escort, but close enough. They rode out in formation, leaving the cabin and barn behind, leaving everything Caleb had built over 6 years sitting empty and vulnerable in the morning sun. The ride to Ashford took less time than usual, the pace set by Henning's urgency to get this done. They didn't talk much. Once, Carter, the youngest deputy, asked Caleb if it was true he'd been an exhibition shooter before coming to the valley. Caleb didn't answer, and Henning told Carter to mind his own business. The town appeared ahead, looking smaller and shabbier than Caleb remembered. As they rode in, people stopped what they were doing to watch. Some faces showed satisfaction, others discomfort, a few something that might have been sympathy. Sam Pickett stood in his doorway again, his expression pained. They rode straight to the jail, a squat building at the end of the main street with bars on the windows and a heavy door. Henning dismounted and gestured for Caleb to do the same. "I'll make this as comfortable as I can," Henning said. "But you understand I can't give you special treatment." "Wasn't expecting any." Inside the jail was what Caleb expected. 2 cells separated by iron bars, a small office area with a desk and gun rack, a wood stove that hadn't been cleaned in months. One cell was empty. The other held a man sleeping off what smelled like a 3-day drunk. Henning unlocked the empty cell and held the door open. "I'll see about getting you some decent meals. Court's in session 3 weeks from now, when Judge Morrison makes his circuit. Until then, you're here?" Caleb walked in, and the door clanged shut behind him. The sound of the lock turning was final, absolute. "Can I get you anything?" Henning asked. "Water? Food?" "Information. What happened to Danny Reeves?" Henning's face was carefully neutral. "Like I said, he left town. Word is he got on the eastbound stage 2 mornings ago, paid cash for a ticket to Kansas." "You believe that?" "I believe he's gone. What that means, I couldn't say." "And Morris?" "Where's he?" "Still in town, staying at the hotel, meeting with company lawyers, planning how to present his case, I'd imagine." Henning paused. "He's scared of you, you know. Tries to hide it, but it shows. Man who sees someone move the way you moved doesn't forget it easily." "Good. Mr. Voss, I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." Henning moved closer to the bars. "Are you Elias Crow?" The question hung between them. Caleb could lie, maintain the fiction he'd built for 6 years, but Henning's eyes said he already knew the answer, was just looking for confirmation. "I used to be," Caleb said finally. Henning nodded slowly. "Thought so. I saw you perform once, must be 8 or 9 years ago. Abilene, I think. You shot the pips off playing cards at 20 paces, split a bullet on an axe blade, and hit 2 targets. Fastest draw I'd ever seen. That was another life. Maybe. But it's the life that's going to keep you alive now. Because when word gets around that Caleb Voss is really Elias Crow, the company's going to think twice about how hard they push. Or they'll send better men to finish it. There's that too." Henning stepped back from the bars. "Either way, the next 3 weeks are going to tell the tale. Try to stay alive that long." He left, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The door closed behind him, and Caleb was alone with the drunk in the next cell and the growing realization of how exposed he was. The first 2 days passed quietly. Henning brought meals himself, decent food from the hotel kitchen, better than jail fare had any right to be. They talked sometimes, careful conversations that circled around the real issues. Henning told him about the other families that had left the valley, the pattern of pressure and violence that had cleared out anyone who wouldn't sell. Caleb shared what he knew about the Garrison Company's methods, the way they operated through proxies and legal manipulation. On the 3rd day, Doc Warren came to visit. The old man looked even more worn than usual, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped his medical bag. Henning led him into the cell area but stayed close, watching. "Mr. Voss," Warren said, his voice tired, "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were being treated properly." "I'm fine, Doc, but I appreciate the concern." Warren glanced at Henning, then back to Caleb. "I've been thinking about the men I treated, about the wounds, the placement. And I'm prepared to testify, if it comes to that, about what the injuries told me." He met Caleb's eyes directly. "Garrett Dean was shot center mass, perfect heart shot. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. Pete Lawson took a round through the shoulder, messy, painful, but deliberately non-lethal. Harlan Cross was shot in the leg, again avoiding major arteries. These weren't panic shots, Mr. Voss. They were precise, controlled, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. That help my case or hurt it?" "Depends how the jury hears it. Could mean you're a cold-blooded killer who knows how to place shots for maximum effect. Or it could mean you were defending yourself while trying to minimize casualties." Warren's expression was earnest. "I'm going to argue for the second interpretation." "Why? You don't owe me anything." "No, but I owe this town something. I've lived here 30 years, watched it grow, watched it struggle, and I've watched the Garrison Company tear through it like a plague, destroying good people's lives for profit. Someone needs to stand up and say it's wrong. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it started to ease. You're putting yourself at risk. I'm an old man with arthritis and a bad heart. What are they going to do, scare me to death? Warren managed a thin smile. Besides, I've already sent my findings to the Territorial Medical Board, with copies to several newspapers. If something happens to me now, it'll raise questions they can't easily answer. Henning spoke up from near the door. Doc, you're playing a dangerous game. We're all playing dangerous games, Marshal. I'm just choosing which side I'm on. Warren turned back to Caleb. I'll see you at the trial. Try to stay optimistic. After he left, Henning shook his head. That old fool's going to get himself killed. Or he's going to change things. Maybe both. The days continued to pass, marked by meals and the changing quality of light through the barred window. Caleb settled into the rhythm of confinement, using the time to think, to plan, to prepare for whatever came next. The drunk in the next cell sobered up and was released, replaced by a cowhand who'd gotten into a fight and would be gone in a day. On the 7th day, Caleb had a visitor he didn't expect. The man who walked in with Henning was in his 40s, lean and energetic, with ink-stained fingers and observant eyes. He wore a vest with multiple pockets, all stuffed with papers and pencils, and carried himself with the restless energy of someone always chasing the next story. Mr. Voss, the man said, extending his hand through the bars. Thomas Garrett, I got your letter. Caleb gripped his hand, feeling a surge of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. You came. Of course I came. You described what sounds like the biggest land grab scheme in the territory, backed by a company with enough money to buy silence and cooperation from half the officials out here. That's exactly the kind of story I live for. Garrett pulled out a notebook and pencil. Tell me everything. They talked for 2 hours. Caleb laid it all out. The systematic pressure on landowners, the violence and intimidation, the disappearances and fires. He told Garrett about Morris and his fake badge, about Blackwood and his threats, about the Garrison Company's stated plan to consolidate the entire valley before the railroad came through. Garrett wrote furiously, asking sharp questions, pressing for details and names and dates. When Caleb finished, the journalist sat back and whistled softly. This is worse than I thought. The Garrison Company's involved in a dozen projects across 3 territories, and if they're using these methods here, they're probably using them everywhere. He tapped his pencil against the notebook. I'm going to need documentation. Proof. I've got my land deed, tax receipts, everything showing my legal claim. It's in my satchel. That's a start, but I'll need more. Testimony from other victims, records of the properties that changed hands, anything that shows the pattern. Garrett looked at Henning, who'd been listening quietly. Marshal, you've been investigating this. What have you got? Henning hesitated. I can't share official evidence with a journalist. Even if that journalist is the only one willing to shine a light on what's really happening here. Even then, Garrett studied him, then nodded. I respect that. But off the record, am I wasting my time? Is there enough here to make a difference? Henning was quiet for a long moment. Off the record? There's more than enough. The problem is proving it in a way that stands up in court. The company's covered their tracks well, and the people who could testify are either gone or too scared to talk. Then we find the ones who'll talk anyway. Garrett stood, tucking his notebook away. Mr. Voss, I'm going to do some digging, interview people, pull land records, follow the money. When your trial comes up, I want to have enough ammunition to make the company think twice about how hard they push. They'll come after you. Let them try. I've been threatened by better men than Henry Blackwood. Garrett's grin was fierce. Besides, the pen is mightier than the sword, or so they say. We're about to find out if it's mightier than corporate greed and hired guns. After he left, Caleb sat on the hard cot and let himself feel something he'd been avoiding, the possibility that this might actually work. That between Doc Warren's testimony, Garrett's investigation, and whatever evidence could be assembled, there might be a chance of winning this fight without more bloodshed. It was a fragile hope, built on the goodwill of a few brave people, and the assumption that truth still mattered in a world increasingly shaped by money and power. But it was something. The next 2 weeks crawled by. Garrett came back 3 more times, each visit bringing news of what he'd uncovered. He'd found 2 families who'd been pushed out, and were willing to testify. He'd tracked down land records showing a pattern of rapid ownership changes, all flowing to companies that were subsidiaries of Garrison. He'd discovered that Judge Morrison, who'd be presiding over Caleb's trial, had received campaign contributions from Garrison-affiliated businesses, though nothing provably illegal. Henning reported that Morris had been seen meeting repeatedly with lawyers preparing his case. The company had brought in additional witnesses, men who'd swear they'd seen Caleb acting erratically in the weeks before the shooting, building a narrative of unstable behavior, violent tendencies, a man who'd snapped under pressure. On the 18th day, Henry Blackwood came to visit. Henning brought him to the cell area, then stepped back, his hand resting casually on his gun. Blackwood looked the same as before, well-dressed, composed, carrying himself with quiet authority. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I hope you're being treated well." "Well enough." "Good. I'd hate to think the territory was mistreating its prisoners." Blackwood moved closer to the bars. "I wanted to make you one final offer before the trial begins." "Not interested. Hear me out. The company is prepared to drop all charges. You plead guilty to a lesser charge, manslaughter, say, or reckless endangerment. Time served covers the sentence. In exchange, you sign over the deed to your property and agree to leave the territory permanently." "No. Mr. Voss, please be reasonable. You're facing murder charges. If convicted, you'll hang. Even if by some miracle you're acquitted, you'll be bankrupt from legal fees and your land will be seized for debts. This way, you walk away alive and free." "Free to go where?" "Free to do what? Spend the rest of my life knowing I gave up because it was easier than fighting?" Blackwood's expression hardened. "You're not going to win this. Even with Doc Warren's testimony, even with that journalist poking around, the company has the resources to overwhelm any defense you mount. The judge, the jury, the outcome, it's all arranged. Then why offer a deal?" The question seemed to catch Blackwood off guard. He recovered quickly, but not before Caleb saw the flicker of uncertainty. "Because a trial is messy," Blackwood said. "Because public attention is inconvenient. Because it's easier to resolve this quietly than to make you into a martyr." "You're worried." "I'm being practical." "No," Caleb said, standing and walking to the bars. "You're worried. About what Garrett's going to publish. About what Doc Warren's going to say on the stand. About the story spreading beyond this valley, beyond this territory. You're worried that killing me might cost more than it's worth." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "You're delusional if you think, I think I've got you scared. Not much, maybe, but enough that you're here offering deals instead of just letting the trial proceed with confidence." Caleb smiled without humor. "That's all I need." For a moment, Blackwood just stared at him, calculating and recalculating. Then he stepped back from the bars. "The offer expires when the trial begins," he said coldly. "After that, whatever happens is on your head. I'll take my chances." Blackwood left without another word. Henning watched him go, then looked at Caleb with something like respect. "You sure you know what you're doing?" the marshal asked. "No," Caleb admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." The trial began on a Tuesday morning under a sky that threatened rain but never delivered. The courthouse was the largest building in Ashford, a 2-story structure with whitewashed walls and a bell tower that had lost its bell years ago. By the time Henning brought Caleb through the front door, the gallery was already packed. Townspeople, ranchers from neighboring valleys, company men in suits, and reporters from as far away as Denver who'd caught wind of what Thomas Garrett had been writing. Judge Morrison sat behind the bench looking exactly like what he was. A political appointee who'd spent more time at fundraising dinners than in actual courtrooms. He was younger than Caleb expected, maybe 45, with carefully groomed hair and a face that showed he'd never missed many meals. His robes looked freshly pressed, and he carried himself with the kind of authority that came from position rather than respect. The prosecution table held 3 lawyers in expensive suits, led by a man named Thornton, who'd made his reputation defending railroad companies against injury claims. They had stacks of documents, multiple witnesses lined up, and the confidence of people who knew the game was rigged in their favor. The defense table held Caleb and a court-appointed lawyer named Sullivan, a young man fresh from some Eastern law school who looked terrified to be there. He'd met with Caleb twice in jail, both times stammering through questions and taking notes with shaking hands. Not exactly the advocate Caleb would have chosen, but beggars couldn't be choosers. The gallery murmured as Caleb took his seat. He could feel eyes on him, hear whispered speculation. Some of it was about the charges, but most of it was about who he really was. Garrett's articles had done their work. The name Elias Crow had been mentioned in print. The legend of the fastest gun in the territories dredged up and connected to the quiet rancher who'd lived among them for 6 years. Morris sat in the front row behind the prosecution, his face still showing yellowing bruises from when his horse had dumped him. Pete Lawson was there too, his arm in a sling, looking pale and diminished. Harlan Cross had testified by deposition from his sickbed, still recovering from the shattered leg that would probably leave him with a permanent limp. Judge Morrison banged his gavel, and the room fell quiet. We're here in the matter of the territory versus Caleb Voss, charged with murder in the death of Garrett Dean, and 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon against Pete Lawson and Harlan Cross. Morrison's voice was formal, rehearsed. How does the defendant plead? Sullivan stood, nearly knocking over his chair. Not guilty, Your Honor. So noted. Mr. Thornton, you may present the prosecution's case. What followed was a masterclass in legal manipulation. Thornton called Morris first, who took the stand and spun a story that bore only passing resemblance to reality. In his version, he'd been a duly authorized representative of the Territorial Land Commission, come to inform Caleb of legitimate tax arrears. Caleb had been belligerent, threatening, had warned them to leave or face consequences. When they'd returned with legal documentation, Caleb had opened fire without warning, murdering Garrett Dean and wounding 2 others before they could defend themselves. Sullivan's cross-examination was weak, fumbling. He got Morris to admit that Garrett and the others had been armed but couldn't shake the core narrative. Morris stuck to his story with the practiced ease of a man who'd been well coached. Pete Lawson testified next, his voice shaking but his words damning. He described Caleb as cold, calculating, shooting with deadly precision. Like he'd done it 100 times before, Pete said, looking directly at the jury. Like killing was just something he knew how to do. Thornton made sure to emphasize that point, that Caleb's skill suggested premeditation, that only someone planning violence would move with such lethal efficiency. The other witnesses were character assassins, people who claimed to have seen Caleb acting strangely in the weeks before the shooting. A rancher who said Caleb had threatened him over a boundary dispute that never happened. A merchant who testified that Caleb had seemed paranoid, talking about being watched. All lies, all carefully constructed, but delivered with enough conviction to plant doubt. By the end of the first day, Caleb could see the jury's faces hardening. 12 men from town and the surrounding area, most of whom had probably already decided his fate before the trial even started. A few looked uncomfortable with what they were hearing, but not enough to matter. That night, back in his cell, Sullivan came to visit. The young lawyer looked defeated. They're going to convict you, he said bluntly. Thornton's too good, and we don't have enough to counter his narrative. What about Doc Warren? He hasn't testified yet. Doc Warren's an old man giving medical opinion. The jury's going to weigh that against 3 eyewitnesses and a pattern of threatening behavior. Sullivan ran his hands through his hair. I'm sorry, Mr. Voss. I'm doing my best, but my best isn't good enough. You could ask the right questions tomorrow. Like what? Caleb leaned forward. Like why a land commission representative would bring hired guns instead of a clerk. Like why the supposed tax documents were never filed with the county assessor. Like why 7 other families left this valley under similar circumstances in the past 6 months. The judge won't let me go there. He's already warned me to stick to the charges at hand, not introduce irrelevant information about unrelated incidents. Then make it relevant. Connect the dots. Make the jury see this isn't about one shooting. It's about a pattern of intimidation and violence designed to steal land. Sullivan looked doubtful. Judge Morrison will shut me down the second I try. Then you make him shut you down in front of the jury. Make him show whose side he's on. Caleb's voice was quiet but intense. You said you're doing your best. Your best means taking risks, pushing boundaries, making them work to suppress the truth. Even if the judge rules against you, the jury will hear the questions. They'll wonder why he wouldn't let you ask them. Something shifted in Sullivan's expression, a spark of either courage or desperation. That could get me disbarred, or it could save an innocent man's life. Sullivan left without committing to anything, but Caleb saw him walking differently, his shoulders a little straighter. Whether that would translate to action in the courtroom was another question. The second day started with Doc Warren on the stand. The old man looked frail in the witness box, but his voice was steady as he described the wounds he'd treated. He walked the jury through each injury: Garrett's fatal chest wound, Pete's shoulder, Harlan's shattered leg, and explained what the placement and trajectory told him about the shooter's intent and skill level. These were not random shots fired in panic, Warren said firmly. Garrett Dean's wound was instantly fatal, suggesting the shooter recognized him as the primary threat and neutralized him first. Pete Lawson's injury, while painful and debilitating, deliberately avoided major arteries. Harlan Cross's leg wound was similarly placed to incapacitate without killing. This is the work of someone with extraordinary marksmanship and conscious control over where their bullets went. Thornton stood for cross-examination, his smile predatory. Dr. Warren, isn't it true that you're not a forensic expert? That you're simply a country doctor with no formal training in ballistics or wound analysis? I've treated gunshot wounds for 30 years. I know what deliberate shooting looks like. Or perhaps you're seeing what you want to see, imposing a narrative on injuries that could just as easily be explained by chance. There's no chance involved when, yes or no, doctor, are you a certified forensic expert? Warren's jaw tightened. No. Then I suggest you stick to medical facts and leave the interpretation to the jury. It was a small victory for the prosecution, undermining Warren's credibility without actually refuting his evidence. But when Sullivan stood for redirect, something had changed. The young lawyer's hands weren't shaking anymore. Dr. Warren, in your 30 years of medical practice, approximately how many gunshot wounds have you treated? Hundreds, maybe close to 1,000. And in that experience, have you seen instances where multiple people were shot in a single incident? Many times. In those instances, were the wounds typically clustered in similar areas, multiple chest wounds, multiple leg wounds, or spread across different parts of the body? Warren understood where he was going. In chaotic situations, where people are firing wildly or in panic, wounds are usually clustered. Everyone aims for center mass, or everyone shoots low. You see patterns that reflect the shooter's state of mind. And the wounds you treated in this case were deliberately varied. One fatal shot to neutralize an immediate threat. 2 non-fatal shots placed with precision to incapacitate without killing. That's not panic. That's control. Sullivan nodded and sat down. It wasn't much, but it was something. A seed of doubt planted in a case that had seemed airtight. Then came Thomas Garrett. The journalist wasn't a witness in the traditional sense. He hadn't been present for the shooting, but Sullivan called him to testify about his investigation into the Garrison Company's activities in the valley. Thornton objected immediately, arguing irrelevance, and Judge Morrison looked ready to sustain. Your Honor, Sullivan said, his voice stronger than Caleb had heard it. The defense contends that Mr. Voss's actions were taken in self-defense against men who came to his property not as legitimate authorities, but as enforcers for a criminal enterprise. Mr. Garrett's testimony establishes the pattern of behavior that proves criminal intent. The charges before this court concern specific actions on a specific day, Morrison said irritably, not alleged patterns or conspiracy theories. Then the defense requests that Mr. Garrett's findings be entered into the record as context for understanding the defendant's state of mind. A man who's been systematically threatened and intimidated has reason to fear for his life when armed men appear on his property. Morrison looked like he'd bitten into something sour. I'll allow limited testimony on context, but Mr. Sullivan, you stray beyond that, and I'll hold you in contempt. Am I clear? Perfectly, Your Honor. Garrett took the stand and laid it out. The research he'd done, the families he'd interviewed, the pattern of land acquisitions flowing to Garrison subsidiaries. He described threats, arsons, disappearances. He talked about documents that showed coordination between company representatives and local officials. And he did it all in clear, measured language that was hard to dismiss as speculation. Thornton's cross-examination tried to paint him as a sensationalist journalist looking for a story, but Garrett had brought copies of property records, sworn affidavits from displaced families, even financial documents showing money changing hands between the company and Judge Morrison's campaign fund. That last revelation caused an uproar. Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly, his face flushed with anger. Mr. Garrett, you will refrain from making unfounded accusations in my courtroom. They're not unfounded, Your Honor. I have the bank records right here. This is outrageous. I should hold you in contempt. For telling the truth? Garrett's voice carried across the courtroom. The people of this territory have a right to know when their judges are compromised by the very interests they're supposed to adjudicate. The gallery erupted. People were shouting, some in support of Garrett, others in outrage. Morrison's gavel rang like a church bell, but it took several minutes before order was restored. When things finally calmed down, Morrison's face was white with fury. "Mr. Garrett, you are excused from this courtroom. Your testimony is stricken from the record. The jury will disregard everything they just heard." But the damage was done. You couldn't unhear what had been said, couldn't ignore the questions that had been raised. The jury looked confused, conflicted, and several of them were staring at Morrison with open suspicion. The trial continued for another day. Sullivan called the two families Garrett had found, people who'd been driven from their land through similar tactics. Their testimony was emotional, compelling, but Thornton managed to get most of it ruled inadmissible as prejudicial. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. Thornton went first, painting Caleb as a dangerous killer who'd murdered an innocent man and wounded two others without justification. He emphasized the precision of the shooting, arguing it showed premeditation. He reminded the jury of their duty to uphold law and order, to send a message that violence wouldn't be tolerated. Then it was Sullivan's turn. The young lawyer stood slowly, walked to the jury box, and just looked at them for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Caleb Voss is a murderer, that he opened fire on lawful representatives without cause. But ask yourselves, what lawful representatives bring hired guns instead of court clerks? What legitimate tax assessment happens without filing documents with the county? What kind of legal proceeding starts with threats and ends with violence?" He paused, letting the question sink in. The evidence shows that Mr. Voss defended his property from men who came to steal it, men armed and ready for violence. Men who drew their weapons first. Dr. Warren's testimony proves that Mr. Voss's shots were precise, controlled. He killed the man who posed the greatest threat and wounded the others to stop the attack without unnecessary bloodshed. That's not murder. That's self-defense by a man who knew his life was in danger. Sullivan's voice grew stronger. "You've heard testimony about other families driven from this valley, about arsons and disappearances, about a pattern of intimidation designed to consolidate land for profit. The prosecution wants you to ignore that context, to see this case in isolation. But you can't separate this shooting from what led to it. You can't ignore that Caleb Voss stood his ground against people who've been terrorizing this valley for months." He turned to look at Caleb, then back at the jury. "This trial isn't really about murder. It's about whether a man has the right to defend what's his, whether the law protects honest citizens or just the powerful and connected. Your verdict will answer that question, not just for Caleb Voss, but for everyone in this territory who's watching to see if justice still means anything." The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Caleb spent that time in a holding cell adjacent to the courtroom, listening to the muffled sounds of argument through the walls. Sullivan sat with him for part of it, both men too tense to make conversation. When the bailiff finally came to bring them back to the courtroom, the sun was setting outside the windows, painting everything in shades of amber. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Judge Morrison called for order, though the gallery was already silent with anticipation. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, a rancher named Michaels, who Caleb knew slightly from cattle auctions. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of murder and the death of Garrett Dean, how do you find?" Michaels looked directly at Caleb. "Not guilty." The gallery erupted again, but Caleb barely heard it. His heart was pounding, relief and disbelief washing over him in equal measure. "On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon against Pete Lawson?" "Not guilty." "On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon against Harlan Cross?" "Not guilty." Morrison looked like he'd swallowed glass. He banged his gavel, called for order, and when the noise finally subsided, he spoke in a voice tight with anger. "The jury has spoken. The defendant is acquitted on all charges and is free to go." He turned to Caleb. "Mr. Voss, you are released from custody immediately." Henning removed the shackles from Caleb's wrists, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he was free. People crowded around. Sullivan pumping his hand, Garrett slapping his back, strangers offering congratulations. But Caleb barely registered any of it. He just wanted to get out of there, to breathe air that didn't smell like confined spaces and legal proceedings. Outside, the street was filling with people. Some celebrating, some angry, most just confused about what had happened and what it meant. Caleb pushed through them, heading toward the livery where Rust had been stabled. A hand grabbed his arm. He turned to find Henry Blackwood, his face carefully composed but his eyes burning with cold fury. "This isn't over," Blackwood said quietly. "You know that, don't you? The verdict doesn't change anything." "It changes everything," Caleb replied. "It proves your company doesn't own this valley, that people can still fight back and win. One victory doesn't mean... It means others will try. It means every family you threatened, every rancher you tried to intimidate, now knows they have a chance." Caleb pulled his arm free. "Your railroad might still come through here, but it'll have to negotiate fairly, pay honest prices. The days of just taking whatever you want are finished." Blackwood's smile was thin and humorless. "You're naive if you believe that. Money and power always win eventually." "Maybe, but not today." Caleb walked away, leaving Blackwood standing in the street. At the livery, Rust greeted him with a soft nicker, and Caleb spent several minutes just standing with the horse, feeling the warmth of muscle and hide, the simple presence of something that didn't judge or calculate or scheme. Henning found him there as he was saddling up. "Congratulations," the marshal said. "Wasn't sure you'd walk away from this." "Neither was I." "What are you going to do now?" Caleb cinched the saddle tight, checked the straps. "Go home. Fix whatever's broken. Try to make a life worth defending. The company's not going to leave you alone." "I know, but they're going to think harder about the cost now." Caleb swung into the saddle. "That's all I can ask for." He rode out of town as the last light faded from the sky, the stars beginning to emerge overhead. The valley opened up before him, dark and quiet, familiar in a way that made his chest ache. When he reached his property line, he stopped for a moment, just looking. The cabin stood where he'd left it, dark but intact. The barn door hung open, creaking slightly in the wind. His cattle had scattered across the larger pasture, but he could see shapes moving in the darkness, still there, still his. He rode up to the cabin and dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a sound that felt like coming home. Inside, everything was covered in dust, the air stale from weeks of being closed up. But nothing had been burned, nothing destroyed. They'd left it alone, confident that legal proceedings would give them everything they wanted. They'd been wrong. Caleb lit a lamp, the warm glow pushing back the shadows. He walked to the loose floorboard and pulled up the wooden box, unwrapped the guns, and looked at them in the lamplight. Elias Crow's weapons, the tools of a life he'd tried to leave behind. He wrapped them back up and put them away. Not buried this time, just stored, available if needed but not carried. Caleb Voss didn't need to be Elias Crow anymore. He'd proven that you could stand your ground without becoming the violence you'd left behind. Over the next few weeks, news of the trial spread. Garrett's articles appeared in papers across 3 territories, exposing the Garrison Company's methods and raising questions about land grabs happening elsewhere. Other families who'd been intimidated started coming forward, filing their own legal challenges. The company found itself fighting battles on multiple fronts, their costs escalating, their reputation suffering. 2 months after the trial, a lawyer arrived at Caleb's property, not representing the Garrison Company, but a railroad consortium that had bought out their interest in the Valley Road. He made a fair offer for an easement across Caleb's land, enough money that Caleb could expand his herd, fix up his buildings, maybe hire some help. Caleb negotiated hard, got them to improve the terms, and signed the agreement. The railroad would come through eventually, bringing change and commerce. But it would come on terms that respected the people who'd built lives here, not as conquest, but as cooperation. Other families started trickling back into the valley, some who'd left, some who'd heard there was land available, and a community worth joining. The town of Ashford slowly came back to life, businesses opening, the school getting a new teacher, the church finding a preacher who actually believed in what he preached. Sam Pickett stopped by one afternoon driving a wagon loaded with lumber. "Heard your barn door's been hanging crooked," he said, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes. "Thought I could help fix it. If you'll let me." Caleb looked at him. This soft man who'd chosen survival over courage, who'd carried that choice like a weight ever since. "I'd appreciate the help," Caleb said. They worked together for the afternoon, not talking much, just the sounds of hammer and saw, the satisfaction of fixing something broken. By the time Sam left, the door hung straight and true. And something between them had been repaired as well. Doc Warren came by occasionally, ostensibly to check on Caleb's health, but really just to talk. The old man seemed lighter somehow, unburdened by the choice he'd made to testify. They'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the valley, sharing whiskey and comfortable silence. "You think it'll last?" Warren asked one night. "This peace we've bought?" "Nothing lasts forever," Caleb said, "but maybe it lasts long enough to matter." "That's a modest ambition." "I'm learning to be modest," Warren chuckled. "Modest men don't shoot 3 people and walk away to tell about it." "Fair point." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge. "You ever regret it?" Warren asked. "Standing your ground instead of running?" Caleb thought about it. About the weeks in jail, the trial, the very real possibility that he could have hanged. About the cost and the fear and the nights he'd lain awake wondering if stubborn pride was worth dying for. "No," he said finally, "because running wouldn't have solved anything. Would have just meant I spent the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when the past would catch up. At least this way I know what I stand for." "And what's that?" "The idea that some things can't be taken, that a man's word and his work and his land mean something beyond what someone's willing to pay for them." Caleb took a drink. "Maybe that's naive. Maybe Blackwood was right that money and power always win eventually, but they didn't win here, not completely. And that's worth something." Warren nodded slowly. "It's worth everything." Years passed. The railroad came through, bringing prosperity but also complications. The valley changed, grew, became something different from what it had been. But the core remained, people who worked the land, who built lives worth defending, who understood that community meant standing together when pressure came. Caleb's reputation faded gradually, the story of the shootout becoming local legend rather than current news. New people moved in who didn't know about Elias Crow, who saw Caleb as just another rancher working hard ground. He preferred it that way. He never married, never had children of his own, but he became a kind of uncle to the valley's kids, teaching them to ride, to work cattle, to understand that everything worth having required effort and care. Some of them learned, some didn't. He tried not to take it personally. Sullivan came by once, years later, now a successful lawyer with his own practice in Silver City. He'd made his reputation defending small landowners against corporate interests, building on the foundation of that first case. "You changed my life," Sullivan told him over dinner. "Showed me that courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about acting despite the fear." "I was terrified that whole trial," Caleb admitted. "I know, but you didn't let it stop you." Sullivan raised his glass. "To standing your ground. To standing your ground," Caleb echoed. He lived on that land for another 23 years, watching the valley transform around him while he remained constant. He saw boom times and drought years, prosperity and hardship, the endless cycle of building and maintaining and rebuilding. When he finally died, peacefully, in his sleep, at an age he'd never expected to reach, the whole valley turned out for the funeral. They buried him on a hillside overlooking his property, with a simple marker that read, "Caleb Voss." He stood his ground. People told stories about him for years after. Some were true, some exaggerated, some entirely invented, but they all carried the same essential truth, that once, when it mattered, an ordinary man had drawn a line and refused to cross it, no matter the cost. The valley remembered. And in remembering, it carried forward the understanding that some things were worth fighting for. Not because victory was guaranteed, but because the alternative, surrendering to fear and greed, and the assumption that power made right, meant losing something more valuable than land or money or even life itself. It meant losing the belief that one person could make a difference, that courage mattered, that standing alone against overwhelming odds wasn't futile but necessary, because someone had to be first. Someone had to draw that line and defend it, so others would know it could be done. Caleb Voss had been that someone. And the valley was different because of it. Not perfect, not free of trouble, but different in the ways that mattered. A place where people could build lives and defend them. Where justice wasn't just for those who could afford it. Where the powerful learned that taking what they wanted came with a cost they might not be willing to pay. The cabin still stands today, weathered and worn, but maintained by people who understand what it represents. The land is still worked, still productive, still home to cattle and crops and the stubborn determination of people who refuse to be moved. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun drops below the western ridge and paints the valley in shades of copper and gold, you can almost see him there, a solitary figure on the porch, watching over land he defended with blood and courage, a reminder that some lines, once drawn, don't break. They hold.